Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. The Great Animal Orchestra is the story of how animals taught us to dance and sing. And it's one of many narratives revealed to us through the voice of the natural world. It's soundscape. A soundscape story can be told through the lens of any of these disciplines. In this new book, I've limited the subject of how we became musical. Just as easily, I could have focused on medicine, the healing properties of natural sound, religion, how natural sound informed spirituality, or even paleontology, recreating the soundscapes of a prehistoric world. This story begins at the end of the last ice age, and I'll set the stage with a couple of short excerpts from the prelude. It is 16,000 years ago, and the plains teem with life, with the presence of the giant armadillo, American cheetahs, saber-toothed tigers, giant beavers, mastodons, camels, caribou, dire wolves, and ground sloths that stand as high as 14 feet on their hind legs. Wildlife is everywhere. Humans haven't made their appearance in North America yet, but birds in great numbers, including pied-billed grebes, storks, Canada geese, ducks, teals, common crows, turkeys, bobwhites, and dowagers, fill the air with flight and song, while tree frogs, peepers, insects, and reptiles saturate the sound field with the intricate tapestry of their voices. It is the end of an ice age, and the leading edge of the massive Wisconsin glacier slowly recedes to the Arctic Circle. With the Earth's warming, the floral world thrives. Pine, oak, and spruce trees, along with larch, aspen, balsam, and poplar, have advanced far to the north along with low-lying shrubs and grasses. The first signs of the boreal forest have taken root in the Western Hemisphere. It thrives through the cold winters and the warm summers, and it is jam-packed with non-human life, whose individual voices coalesce into an intense and collective symphony. The planet itself abounds with a vigorous resonance that is as complete and expansive as it is delicately balanced. Every place with its vast populations of plants and animals becomes a concert hall, and everywhere a unique orchestra performs an unmatched symphony, with each species' sound fitting into a specific part of the score. It is a highly evolved, naturally wrought masterpiece. Humans, too, are making their sound heard. They are dispersing now, spreading across the planet, leaving behind tangible, visible, and acoustic symbols of their presence wherever they go. Detailed pictographs and petroglyphs, bone instruments, hunting and skinning tools, and evidence of larders to store excess grain, which they've managed to harvest from early seed plantings. They're pulling together in larger and larger groups, but basically, they're still hunters. The forest is whispering to them, luring them in and revealing where the objects of their hunt can be found. At this stage of their development, sound-rich habitats are humans' most significant acoustic influences. The sounds of animal life, organisms from microscopic to huge, and those from the non-biological landscape dominate the rather modest noises humans generate. They have limited language skills to express what they feel, but they borrow some from what they hear all around them to convey emotion. Perhaps through their body movement and vocal responses, so evocative of a successful life heard everywhere, these modern humans will convince the other creatures that they are all just an extension of one sonorant family. This is the tuning of the Great Animal Orchestra, a revelation of the acoustic harmony of the wild, the planet's deeply connected expression of natural sounds and rhythm. It is the baseline for what we hear in today's remaining wild places, and it is likely that the origins of every piece of music we enjoy and word we speak come at some point from this collective voice. At one time, There was no other acoustic inspiration. Because I don't have great vision, my world has been largely informed by sound. I began my career as a musician, studying violin from the time I was about 3.5, and then switched to guitar and then synthesizer in the process. The first album that my late music partner Paul Beaver and I did for Warner Brothers was based on the theme of ecology, and it's one of the earliest pieces of music to experiment with whole natural soundscapes as a component of orchestration. Here's an example of a piece that we did, and it's called Walking Green Algae Blues from our first Warner Brothers album, In a Wild Sanctuary. Collecting the natural sounds for this album meant recording in the field for the first time outside of a studio, and it was a life-changing experience for me. It took place in Muir Woods, just to the north of San Francisco across the Golden Gate Bridge. And when I switched on the recorder for the first time, listening to a stereo version of natural sounds through my earphones, it was an epiphany. And I determined at that point that I was going to spend the rest of my life, as much as I could, outside in the field, recording natural soundscapes. Well, what is it about music that we got from animals? Take a look at this. This is the first page of Beethoven's Fifth. And the reason I'm showing you this is because I want to show you how sound is organized in music. Time is represented from left to right on the x-axis, and from the bottom to the top, from the lowest note to the highest note on the y-axis. Bass is on the bottom line and the flute's way on the top line. I just wanted to show you this as a structure for sound. And this is a spectrogram, and a spectrogram is a visualization, a graphic of sound. And you can see on the bottom line again the same organization that we talked about before. Harps and violins are in the middle of the page. The flute is sort of at the top line. You can see it noted there. At about 1 kilohertz, bass is in the bottom. And this is what this sounds like. See that all of these instrumental voices, the violins, the flutes, the harps, the cello, and the bass, are all arranged so that they stay out of each other's way. They don't mask each other. They work in a complementary manner, both in terms of frequency and also temporally. How did we arrive at this concept and organization of sound? Imagine for a moment all of the sounds you've heard during the period of one day. What are the sources? Well, the soundscape was first identified by R. Murray Schafer in his seminal book, Tuning of the World, which was published in 1977. And by the soundscape, Schafer meant every sound that reaches the ear at a given time. Now for my work, it was necessary to break the soundscape down into more detail and address all of the sources. And basically, there are 3 of them. The first is the geophony, or the non-biological sound that comes from the natural world. The effects of wind in the trees or grasses, weather sounds, water running in a stream or waves at the ocean, or geophysical sound, the movement of earth. The second is the biophony, and these are the non-human biological sounds that come from natural habitats. Usually, in a healthy habitat, they're organized, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. The third source is human-induced sound, or what I call anthrophony. And it includes physiological sound, electromechanical sound like automobiles and trucks, pile drivers, leaf blowers, and controlled sound like music and theater. Anthrophony affects greatly what happens with biophony and geophony and how we experience them. And geophony, of course, were the first sounds heard on Earth. Biophony is the most important for me, and it posits that in many wild habitats, creatures vocalize in special relationships with one another, cooperative or competitive, much like instruments in an orchestra. And this partitioning of critter voices into time and frequency bandwidth gives us some really great tools by which to evaluate our relationships to the natural world. And of course, it was biophony that first inspired humans to dance and sing. I was talking a few slides back about the organization of sound, and I showed a slide of the opening bars of Beethoven's Fifth. Well, think of this spectrogram as a bar of music, with the horizontal lines across the page representing lines on musical staff, and the notes being read again from left to right. And you can see that this page shows very clear discrimination between the animals. The cicadas, of course, above 2 kilohertz, the Malaysian eared nightjar around 1200 hertz, chestnut winged babbler at about 4500 hertz, and the gibbons, of course, down on the bottom. Notice how the insects are represented across the top of the page just below 8.2 kilohertz. You'll notice that there's not only frequency niches here, but there's also temporal niches. When the chestnut winged babbler stops singing, the Malaysian eared nightjar comes in, followed by the chestnut winged babbler again, and then the Malaysian eared nightjar, followed by the cicada. So there's a temporal relationship and a frequency relationship. Notice the gibbons on the bottom, of course, that's where mammals usually are. The bandwidth, both frequency and time, is really seminal to this discussion. But expressed here on this page are proto-music, biology, physics, natural history, and all these fields are expressed in a 10-second audio example. From the biophony of a sight to a recording to an image, it's a story that can lead us down many paths. And here's a story of resource management told through the biophony. Selective logging was supposed to take place in 1988 at a location about 3.5 hours drive east of San Francisco in the Sierra Nevada mountains, a place called Meadow. One of my graduate students said that this image kind of looks like an impressionistic painting of a forest. I want to play this for you first, and then we'll discuss what we're hearing. Represented here are McGillivray's warbler, Lincoln, chipping and white-crowned sparrows, American robins, golden-crowned kinglet, sapsucker, and a mountain quail. You notice a little picture in the inset in the lower right. It represents Lincoln Meadow before selective logging. We were told that there'd be no effect. However, logging took place in the summer of 1988 after this recording was made. And in 1989 and 15 times subsequently, I've gone back and recorded again. And this is what it looks and sounds like now. To our eye, the place looks undisturbed, but the soundscape tells a very different story. While a picture may be worth 1,000 words, a soundscape is worth 1,000 pictures. And although Leopold once said, if we're going to tamper with nature, we better keep all the parts, I'd add that we might want to keep the schematics and the building plans too. This next slide is one of a Fijian coral reef. The lower half of the spectrogram is represented by the sounds of waves at the surface, and the top half of the spectrogram are 11 different species of fish. This is a living coral reef in Vanuatu in Fiji. 400 meters to the south of where the first recording was made, the coral reef is beginning to die. It's becoming bleached, and you can see the wave action again at the bottom half of the page, and just a few lines of snapping shrimp represented at the top half. That's what a stressed coral reef sounds like as differentiated from a living coral reef. This is a 10-second spectrogram of the Great Basin's spadefoot toad, chorusing. What happens is the toads dig themselves down about a meter under the surface of the hard-pan desert soil. And then when the carapace that surrounds them detects moisture that occurs during spring melts, the frogs will then claw their way to the surface and gather in large numbers around these vernal pools. And they learn to chorus together in a way that the predators around there, like foxes and coyotes and great horned owls, can't draw a bead on any one of them. So they learn to work as a community in sync, and this is what their voice sounds like. When anthrophony in great enough volume occurs, it breaks the synchronicity of the chorus, and the frogs, losing their synchronicity, are detectable by predators. And here's an example of what happened when a military trainer flying at 100 meters above ground level in the Meadow Basin broke the frog chorusing. You can see the breaks in the chorusing that occur at 2, 4, and 6 seconds. And because it was a full moon that night, we could see foxes coming in to pick off an occasional frog. And actually, for a while, because there were so many jet planes flying over the basin, the frog population did diminish for some time. Because the frequency of the flights has now dropped off, the toad population has returned to more or less normal. When I was in school in the 1950s, there was a lot of resistance in biological sciences to anthropomorphism. The old Cartesian trope, do animals have feelings or emotion? But emotional expression, happiness or sadness, is very much a part of music. Well, what inspired us to formulate sound that way? And here's a story told to me by a beaver. A colleague of mine who had been recording in Minnesota around this pond for many years was working a few springs ago when a pair of wildlife rangers appeared from out of nowhere and dropped a stick of dynamite down the beaver dam that had been built up at one end of the pond where my colleague had been recording. This was during the breeding season of 2008. The explosion killed the female and the offspring, leaving the wounded male beaver to swim in circles around the pond, crying out, searching for its mate. This is probably the saddest sound I've ever heard. The late Lauren Isley once said, "I have never entered a wood but what I hear footsteps in the leaves, tiptoeing away." Here's another story that's revealed by the soundscape, and it's how geophony inspired biophony. And the question is, what's the link between thunderstorms that occur at the equator and critter voices in the Arctic and Antarctic? Well, the thunderstorms at the equator release electrical energy, and it's transmitted through the Earth's magnetic field to both poles. And these sounds, which are recorded by NASA with low-frequency radio receivers in the Antarctic and the Arctic, are called whistlers. And here's what some of those sounds sound like when picked up by those receivers. Now listen to the Weddell seal. And 10,000 miles away, the bearded seal. In many habitats of the world, there are animals that have learned to sing together in harmony or synchronicity with one another. And here's a perfect example. These are gibbon duets. And the Dayak who live in Borneo believe that the gibbon songs are so beautiful that they cause the sun to rise in response. And just a few months ago, the National Geographic Society reported that operatic sopranos use the same techniques as gibbons to produce their vocalizations. Here's an example of what I was driving at the beginning when I was talking about how animals taught us to dance and sing. Those groups that still live closely connected to the natural world, like the Bayaka in the Central African Republic, use the sounds of the forest as a natural karaoke orchestra with which they perform. And here's a perfect example. In the bottom line, below 1 kilohertz, you'll see this flute player playing. He's playing to the rhythm of that frog, the little dotted line above 2 kilohertz in the middle of the page, and also in sync with the other animals that are vocalizing at that particular time. In other words, the sounds of the forest are inspiring this fellow to play the flute, and to play the flute with him. But we're also inspired to dance like the deer, the buffalo, and the bear. I began the discussion of this book by asking the question, what does music of the West have to do with nature? And I took a random number of composers, actually over a dozen of them, to see what it was that they were doing in their music that related to the natural world. Vivaldi was one of them, Debussy, and certainly Messiaen, who was a wonderful ornithologist, and he tramped through the woods with his wife Yvonne to capture the sounds of birds. But what was interesting about his work is that he only wrote down and notated the birds that happened to fit the musical paradigms of the academy that he was part of. In other words, all the other birds that he wasn't able to transcribe, he dismissed. And what's interesting to me is that of the 10,000 birds that are represented in the world, less than 100 of them have been used in Western music. But here's another interesting thing. I'm going to play some short excerpts now of Alan Hovhaness and George Crumb, both American composers, and they've written pieces of music representative of a certain animal. It happens to be the same animal. And think in your mind for a second as I'm playing these excerpts, what animal this music represents. The question that I raise in the book again, what is it about these particular animals that sound musical to us, that happen to fit those musical paradigms? Here's an example of a common potu, which comes from Mesoamerica and the Amazon. And here's a musician wren, a very musical critter. And this one in particular reaches a point where it goes through its musical phrase and it's interrupted by a parrot. And it stops, waiting for the parrot to finish its vocalization. And then it picks up its theme exactly where it left off. And this last recording is of two baby vultures I found in the hollow of a ficus tree in the eastern part of Ecuador. Now, why aren't these musical? As Luc Ferry, the French author who wrote The New Ecological Order, said, "Nature is beautiful when it imitates art." Did you know that anemones make a sound? We dropped a hydrophone down the mouth part of the anemone, and the tentacles wrapped around it looking for something of nutritional value. And when they didn't find it, this is the result. In 2005, we had heard that there had never been a soundscape recording done in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And because the refuge is always under threat of resource extraction and development, we wanted to go there for ourselves and actually record a good baseline before any further exploration occurred. And so in 2006, I took 3 teams, one at the Beaufort Sea, a little bit upslope toward the Brooks Range to the south, and I was stationed south of the Brooks Range in the tundra at the westernmost part of the boreal forest that stretches from the Maritimes all the way to Alaska. This program was funded with generous support from Google, Lucasfilm, Harvard, Stanford, University of Utah, Patagonia, Johnson Outdoor Industries, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And here are examples of 3 sites that we recorded at. We were told, of course, that there was nothing there in the Arctic Refuge by a couple of senators from Alaska. This is Timber Lake, the southernmost site that we recorded at, which is part of the boreal forest. This is Sunset Pass, which is up the north slope about 70 miles from the Beaufort Sea. And this is the Beaufort Lagoon. Facing south, you can see the Brooks Range at the horizon. And finally, I want to leave everyone with the thought tonight that soundscape ecology is a budding new field. It's just a few decades old. Biophonies and geophonies are the signature voices of the natural world. And as we hear them, we're endowed with a sense of place, the true story of the world we live in. A habitat's condition cannot be fully described by a photograph or a video. However, its true state can be more thoroughly tested by reflective listening. In a matter of seconds, a soundscape reveals much more content from many perspectives. And do remember this, the whisper of every leaf and creature implores us to love the natural sources of our lives, which indeed may hold secrets of love for all things, especially our own humanity. Thank you for listening.
So Bernie, I'm going to open it up to the audience. I doubt you'll be able to hear them, so I'll repeat your questions, their questions to you. So to everyone out there, if it's a relatively short question, I'm happy to do that. If you have something longer, maybe you can just queue up and I'll let you take my place here. So anyone with a question for Bernie or observation? Yeah.
When composing his own music using samples of animal sounds, who were some of his influences? Specifically, was he ever influenced by Bela Bartok's night music?
Bernie, were you able to hear that at all?
I heard little parts of it. You want to repeat it?
So yeah, absolutely. So when recording animal music and recording your own music, rather, your influences were Bela Bartok.
I was wondering who his influences were and if he was influenced by Bela Bartok, specifically night music.
So Bela Bartok's night music, was that an influence for you, or more generally, what were your influences?
Well, more generally, my influences were R. Murray Schafer, the Canadian composer, and John Cage. And oddly enough, not so much Western composers. It was mostly the music that came out of Africa, and in particular the Central African Republic. Now, my early music, of course, I had no idea what was going on in the natural world, and that soundscapes that had so much of an influence, so strong of an influence on our music, particularly the origins of music. So I was pretty much limited to, most of us learned at Juilliard or Eastman School of Music, or some of the music departments in most of our better institution, and that is that humans created music, and that's all there is to it, and that's the end of the subject. But I came to understand listening to music like Iparo in the Amazon Basin, or the Caladan of Papua Guinea, that maybe from another dimension, this idea that we hadn't really thought of.
Excellent. More questions? Yeah.
The choral or orchestral character of some of the presentations Bernie had in his video suggest a mutuality or sense of relatedness among sounds. Is that something that he's explored further, what this orchestral character of sound and subjectivity?
So yeah, Bernie, did you hear that, by the way?
I did.
Okay, great.
Yeah. The organization of sound really came, if you take a look at some of these spectrograms from almost any place in the natural world, it's really clear how, especially as you get more to the equator, it's really clear how structured and how organized these biophonies are. And when you hear the music that comes from groups that live more closely connected to the natural than we do, it's absolutely I mean, the same between what it is you hear in their musical expression and what's happening in the forest is about as clear as it can get. There's almost no discrimination. As a matter of fact, those soundscape are what inspire a lot of groups break into song, and they only break into certain kinds of song relationship to the structure of the soundscape around it, numbers of critters that they're vocalizing and how they're vocalizing. And that includes the polyrhythms and the melodies and the complicated harmonic structure they're using.
Great. So if you're loud, Bernie might just hear you.
Okay.
So feel free to bellow.
Do you think that these choral pieces are improvisational, or are they the same every time?
Did you get that, Bernie?
Yes, I did. Well, they're structured the same way every time. They're not exactly what happened in the natural world. You hear context and content means the same under the same condition, whether it's weather conditions or seasonal conditions. However, the performances are always shifting slightly from one performance to another. So the expression of the context and content is almost always in a state of flux. However, the content and context remain the same. It's really kind of a conundrum, but it's true that what's going on.
Curry?
Did you play your recordings from the Brooks Range in Alaska for the Alaskan senators?
No, it's funny you should ask. When I was working with the National Park Service, we got a letter from Don Young from Alaska and a jerk from California by the name of Richard Pombo, who was a representative here. And they sent this letter to the Secretary of the Interior, Gail Norton, and this was during the last administration, of course. And it was in 2003, and they said that the word soundscape was too left-wing. And that the National Park Service had to eliminate it from all of their documents that they were showing to the public. And so as far as Alaska is concerned, you mentioned an interesting point, because Don Young stood before Congress with a large white poster with nothing on it. He said, "This is what's happening in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge," and there was nothing there. Of course, we dispelled that when we went up there in 2006, and the first soundscape report, by the way, that have ever been done there. I can't believe it. Here's one of the most pristine places on the planet, and nobody's actually ever taken the time to go up there and record.
More questions? Yes. You can.
So if the species coordinate their sounds to create these biophonies, if you lose one species, does that throw the other ones off?
Well, that niche has to be filled, and it is filled. What's remarkable about dense diversity that occurs in an natural environment, particularly as you get closer to the equator, where the density and diversity is highest, what happens is these niches are very carefully structured, and what happens when one critter drops out or one fish drops out, there's another that comes in immediately to fill that void. And it's pretty neat how that all comes together. It's like keeping the symphony intact. I want to add something else if I can to that. One of the things that I noticed from our in Amazon was that the Biopic Expression is kind of structured as if Darwin himself were depicting the sonic timelines of evolution. The choruses in the healthy habitats went like this. First, the insects established Earth-stick territory within the frequency spectrum, and then reptiles and amphibians joined the chorus, establishing other niches. And once those were set, Then came the birds and finally the mammals. All of the critters together, creating not only frequency bandwidth, but temporal needs as well.
Thank you, Bernie, for your beautiful video and your life work. I wonder, two questions. One, have you ever worked with Paul Winter, who does the whales and the birds, and then brings them to New York City with the winter solstice and so on? And my other question is, you're doing so much, so I don't want to ask something impossible, but have you been able to, or have some of your assistants been able to work with people in various parts of the world to continue this recording and keep this project going?
Yeah, the answer to the second question, the answer to the first question is yes, and that's the Paul Winter question. However, Paul is part of an older tradition, I think, and that tradition is one where we've been limited to fragment capture of individual species, and where we separate these creatures out of context. It makes it incoherent. To me, it's a little like trying to understand Beethoven's Fifth Symphony by abstracting the voice of a single violin out of context of the orchestra and hearing it. And pretty much what we've been doing, we take a wolf or a bird or a whale, signature creatures that seem to signify our connection to the natural world. To me, you need to do that more coherently, the whole structure. And that's why that's why this work is so important. And answer to the second question, there are a number of institutions right now, and hopefully Boston will be one of them. There are a number of institutions like Michigan State University and the Envirosonics Department, and Purdue University in the Forestry Department. They're actually using these soundscape ecology models that I and a few other of my colleagues created. And they're doing wonderful studies using of assessing habitats. And it evolved out of landscape ecology and acoustic ecology. So there are many things happening right now. And my hope is that it's going to also happen maybe at Princeton.
Yeah, Kim.
Why did you choose the blues for Walking Green Algae Blues?
I didn't know better. And Paul and I were just kind of thrashing around trying to figure out how to express a new idea in 1968, which a new idea for us, of course, which was ecology. I grew up in a household in the Midwest and East that was terrified of animals. I mean, a goldfish was dangerous to my parents. And it wasn't until that moment we had to go into the wood natural sound for the first time in 1968 that I experienced the wonders of the biophony, of the spatial environment that was illuminated by listening to this through earphones. It's really a marvelous experience. For me, it just changed everything in my life.
John.
We heard some of the soundscape in the sea, and that was particularly new to me, Bernie. And I just wanted to ask you, could you say anything more about seascape sounds?
Well, yeah, the same thing occurred. The same kind of biophony and geophony relationship occurs in a marine environment. Around coral reef, for instance, as I showed in the clip there, you're able to see what happens when pollution and global warming, also humanoid effect as well. And you can see that acidification is having an effect as well, because that's an example of acidification in particular coral reefs. So, yeah, I mean, the same as a marine environment, my background is in marine bioacoustics. But I really think that I've been spending more time the last 25 years on interesting matters, though. But also, I should add, the thing that they're in Oxford is they're recording the sounds of viruses. Virus.
That's amazing. And Bernie, what do viruses sound like?
They're very small.
I should have known. So go ahead.
Sorry, I'll control myself.
First, I'd like to say the term anthrophony, is that what you said? I think it is.
Anthrophony.
Anthrophony. I want to thank you for that. It's a very good term. I'm not sure if that's in the dictionary yet or not, but it should be. Nevertheless, I'd like to go back.
It's Wikipedia now.
Is it really? Well, you've answered a question as far as that's concerned, but I'd like to go back. You mentioned like the tonal values of the soundscape chorus itself, in that the insects kind of set the tempo and the initial sounds, and as evolution came forward, other sounds filled in the niche as we were talking about. I'm wondering, do you personally, with your experience over your career, do you feel that sound itself has, in effect, affected evolution?
In what sense?
In that, like, for example, mammals have generally bass or lower tones, and insects have like the higher trebles and things along those lines. Do you feel like, because I've always thought that like environment can influence well, obviously it influences the type of music that humans will make, and also the music that animals will make. And I'm wondering if there's a connection between the sound and like the evolution of life itself. Well, it's a long question. I'm trying to simplify it.
No, I understand. My thought on it is that insects and mammals and all the different critters that inhabit a particular environment, they're all vocalizing in spectral relationships to one another, and in the older habitats still viable, these critters have found their vocal niches in which to express themselves. If their voices are masked, they're not going to be heard. So they had to, and if their voices represent behavior that need in order to survive, they'd better now find a place in the niche where their voices can be heard. Otherwise, they're not going to survive. I hope that answers your question.
It does. I'd like to talk to you about it further, but I don't want to monopolize the group, so thank you, yes.
I started going through the 5 senses and came to the sense of smell. I wonder if, when you've gone to locations, certainly that would also be an experience. Is there anything comparable or anybody you know of that's looking at olfactory gradations from the environment that could be actually bio, geo, and anthro as well?
I'm sure there is. I'm not familiar with it because it's as Barack Obama said, it's not in my case yet.
Yeah, go ahead.
Have you ever shown your work to any string theorists who believe that at the base, that foundationally everything really is a vibration?
Yes, I have had some questions about that. They've been inconclusive, but certainly it's been brought up. Yeah.
So Bernie, we've actually gone over time, but I have one question. Am I remembering correctly there's a story about you recording in a forest and a tiger? Is that right?
No, it wasn't a tiger, it was a jaguar.
Jaguar, right. So would you just share that maybe as a parting shot for us? I mean, just to show what you've done to do this over the years.
Well, it was, what you're talking about is an incident when I was walking through the forest working in the Amazon,
And I was with a colleague, and it was midnight or so, and it was very dark. And as we were walking through the forest, we picked up the scent of a nearby jaguar, because the jaguar was scent marking it as we went along. So we knew it was there, but didn't want to shine flashlight to find out exactly where it was. And it was tracking us along this forest. We were walked about a mile or so, and then split off in 2 different directions. And my colleague went off in one direction, I went off in the other. And when I set up my mic, 15 minutes later, I have a mic that's about 30 feet long. And so I was sitting that far from and all of a sudden I put on my earphones and turned on the recorder. Apparently that jaguar just stepped right up to the microphone and began to growl. I won't tell you. That's the response was. But I will say that it was an illuminating moment, and I did capture the sound of that jag, and it's a wonderful piece. And by the way, it can be found in my new book, The Great Animal Orchestra. And if you buy the paperback, which comes out on the 12th, there are little icons at the end of each paragraph that represents the sound I've been discussing. And you can go right to the website and pull the samples from that, from those icons.
Great. So, thank you, Bernie Krause.
By Leopold.
Excuse me?
Can I add one thing?
Oh, absolutely.
By Leopold. You know, he said, if you're going to tamper with nature, you better keep all the parts. And on that note, have a great weekend.
On that, you too.
Thank you. Thank you.